Hey everyone, Mrs. Lewis here, back for another reading for our Ancient Greece unit. Again, we are using our purple textbook, History Alive, The Ancient World by TCI. And today we're going to be reading chapter 26, which is talking about government in ancient Greece and essentially how they got to democracy, which is what our country has. Even though our democracy today looks a little bit different than the ancient Greek democracy, and we'll kind of look at how those two are different. So today we're reading chapter 26, The Rise of Democracy, section 1, Introduction. In chapter 25, you learned how the steep mountains of Greece led people to settle in isolated communities, meaning far away, separated. Because settlements were separated from each other, they developed in different ways. One important difference was how they governed themselves. In this chapter, you will learn how ancient Greek communities tried different forms of government. The ancient Greeks knew they had many things in common. For example, they all spoke the same language, but they did not think of themselves as one country. Instead, every Greek identified with a hometown that he or she called the city. The city included both a settlement and its surrounding farmland. Most Greeks were fiercely proud of their cities. Each city had its own laws, its own army, and its own money, or form of currency. Most important, each city had its own form of government. For this reason, ancient Greek cities are called city-states. In this chapter, you will explore the 4 forms of government that developed in the Greek city-states: monarchy, oligarchy, tyranny, and democracy. You'll discover why unhappiness with one form of rule led the Greeks to try another. Next, we're reading chapter 26, section 2, Monarchy, One Person Inherits Power. From about 2000 to 800 BCE, most Greek city-states were ruled by a monarch or a king. In a monarchy, the ruling power is in the hands of only one person, usually a king. Greek settlements did not have queens. At first, Greek kings were chosen by the people of a city-state. When the king died, another leader was selected to take his place. Eventually, though, kings demanded that their power go to their children after their death, usually their oldest son. In a monarchy, then, rulers inherit their power. They get it from the generation before them. Inherit. The kings of ancient Greece had many powers. They made laws and acted as judges. They conducted religious ceremonies. They even led the army during wars. They used armed soldiers to punish people who disobeyed the laws or didn't pay their taxes. Kings had councils of aristocrats to advise them. The word aristocrat is formed from a Greek word that means best. To the Greeks, the best people were wealthy men who had inherited large pieces of land. At first, councils of aristocrats had no real power, but kings depended upon aristocrats for helping during wars since only the wealthy could afford horses and armor. The aristocrats soon realized that as a group, they were stronger than the king. We've seen this before. China, anyone? They wanted a share in the king's power. In some city-states, aristocrats insisted that the king should be elected instead of inheriting his crown. Then they said the king should rule only for a certain number of years. Eventually, aristocrats in most city-states overthrew the monarchy and took the power for themselves. By 800 BCE, kings no longer ruled most Greek city-states. Next, we're going to read chapter 26, section 3, Oligarchy, A Few People Share the Power. By 800 BCE, most Greek city-states were ruled by a small group of wealthy men. These men were called oligarchs, from a Greek word that means few. In an oligarchy, the ruling power is in the hands of a few people. Most Greek oligarchs were aristocrats, men who had inherited land from their families. A few were wealthy merchants. Compared to the poor, oligarchs had very comfortable lives. They spent their days hunting and taking part in chariot races. In the evenings, they lay on couches and drank wine. They had parties where slaves and hired professionals entertained guests with music, dance, and acrobatics. Meanwhile, the poor had to work all day in the fields. The hardworking poor saw the difference between their lives and the easy lives of the wealthy, and they thought it was very unfair. To make matters worse, the oligarchs ignored the needs of most of the people. They passed laws that the poor did not like, and they used the army to force people to obey them. Many of their laws protected and increased their own wealth. In some city-states, oligarchs passed laws forcing farmers to sell themselves into slavery if they could not pay their debts. Under the oligarchs, the rich became richer and the poor became poorer. Many people who weren't wealthy came to hate the oligarchs. Eventually, the poor turned to their leaders who promised to improve their lives. These leaders were usually in the army. Backed by the people, they used their soldiers to throw the oligarchs out of power. That brings us to chapter 26, section 4, tyranny. One person takes power by force. During the mid-600s BCE, so about 200 years later than our previous section, people in many Greek city-states turned to men who promised to change the government. They weren't happy with the oligarchs. The men who forced the oligarchs from power were called tyrants. The person is a tyrant, the government is tyranny. Two different pronunciations, I know. In a tyranny, the ruling power is in the hands of one person who is not a lawful king. A tyranny is different from a monarchy in two ways. First, a tyrant cannot claim that he has a legal right to rule. Second, a tyrant's son does not usually inherit his father's power. Tyrants usually took and kept control by force, but that doesn't mean they were always unpopular. Most Greek tyrants were military leaders who gained the support of the people by promising them more rights. And once they were in control, many Greek tyrants ruled well. They made changes that helped the poor. Some canceled the debts of poor farmers. Others were hostile to aristocrats and may have taken away their land. Other tyrants, though, did not use their power to help the people. Hippias, the last tyrant of the city-state of Athens, is one example. Along with his brother, Hipparchus, Hippias ruled well at first. Then two enemies of the brothers murdered Hipparchus. After that, Hippias ruled more harshly. He paid spies to report anyone who criticized him. As his rule became more and more unbearable, he was finally forced to leave power. Soon Athens would try another form of government, one that shared power among all the citizens. All right, you guys, and our last section in chapter 26, which is on Greek government, is going to bring us to section 5, democracy. All citizens share power. Around 500 BCE, so about 100 years after the whole tyranny section, the people of Athens decided to try governing themselves. They developed democracy, or rule by the people. In a democracy, all citizens share in the ruling power. Ancient Greek democracy was different from democracy today. The government of Athens was a direct democracy. In this type of government, every citizen can vote on every issue. Unlike Athens, the United States is a representative democracy. In this type of government, people vote for their representatives who decide issues in their name. So nowadays we don't vote on absolutely every decision that needs to be made, but we're only going to be voting on those larger issues. So that's what we call a representative democracy. So how did direct democracy work in Athens? The city had an assembly or law-making group. Any free man could speak in the assembly and vote on a new law or a proposal to go to war. Free men also ran the city's day-to-day business. Not all Greeks believed that democracy was a good type of government. Powerful speakers sometimes persuaded ordinary citizens to vote unwisely. Often the assembly reversed important decisions just after a few weeks. Because of problems like these, most city-states returned to earlier forms of government, such as dictatorships or oligarchies. But the idea that people should rule themselves would survive. In time, the idea of democracy would become one of the great gifts of ancient Greece to the modern world. All right, that's it for chapter 26 on Greek government. Our mini project for this chapter is going to be creating a picto-word, which we will have plenty of examples to share with you. Essentially what you're going to do is you're going to take different images, to represent one of these 4 types of government and what it stood for, who was in power, how power was passed down. And don't worry, there'll be more directions on how to create your Greek pictoword for one of the 4 types of government, either monarchy, oligarchy, tyranny, or democracy. Stay tuned.